Hi, I'm Jasmine. I thought love meant partnership, security, building a life together. Instead, after 8 years of marriage and sacrificing my career for his dreams, my ex husband Derek served me divorce papers and locked me out of our dream home while I was at my mother's funeral. No warning, no conversation, just a text message that said, "Lawyer will contact you," and security cameras that suddenly didn't recognize my face at the gate I'd helped design. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I'd funded his real estate empire with my inheritance. I'd given up my marketing director position to manage his properties full time. I'd worked 16-hour days turning his scattered investments into a multi-million-dollar portfolio. And somehow, I was still just the wife, with no legal claim to anything we'd built together. But the worst part wasn't losing the house or the money. It was realizing that while I'd been building our future, he'd been systematically erasing me from it. And when I finally fought back, he tried to destroy what little I had left. Before we dive in, have you ever trusted someone so completely that you ignored all the warning signs? Drop a comment below and tell me about a time someone took advantage of your loyalty. Sometimes sharing these stories reminds us we're not alone in our pain. Because some betrayals don't just break your heart, they teach you exactly who deserves your future. The December rain hammered against the windshield of my rental car as I sat in the parking lot of Riverside Memorial Gardens, staring at the modest headstone that marked my mother's final resting place. The funeral had been small, quiet, attended by neighbors who remembered her famous apple pies and the coworkers who'd watched her battle cancer with more grace than anyone deserved to carry. Mom had been gone for exactly 4 hours when my phone buzzed with Derek's text. Not a call, not even the courtesy of hearing his voice deliver the news that would shatter what remained of my world. Just 12 words that felt like ice water in my veins. Lawyer will contact you about divorce proceedings. Don't come to the house. I stared at the message until the letters blurred, raindrops from my hair mixing with tears I couldn't seem to stop. 8 years of marriage. 8 years of believing we were building something together. 8 years of naive faith that love meant loyalty, that partnership meant protection. The drive back to Millbrook Heights took 37 minutes. Long enough for the shock to crystallize into something harder, colder. Our house sat at the end of Magnolia Lane, a sprawling colonial with white columns and black shutters that I had fallen in love with the moment we toured it as newlyweds. The circular driveway curved past the rose garden I'd planted, the oak trees we'd chosen together, the life we'd promised to share until death do us part. Except Derek had apparently decided to skip the death part. I pressed my key fob at the gate. Nothing. Pressed it again. The red light blinked mockingly, as foreign as if I'd never lived here at all. Through the wrought iron bars, I could see my car, my silver BMW that I'd bought with my own signing bonus before I'd given up my career, parked in the driveway like a prisoner behind enemy lines. My hands shook as I called Derek's number. Straight to voicemail. His smooth voice, the one that had whispered promises and future plans, now delivered a corporate message about being unable to take my call. Unable, as if I were a telemarketer instead of the woman who shared his bed that very morning before driving to bury my mother. That's when I noticed the security camera mounted on the gate post. New, gleaming black metal that definitely hadn't been there when I'd left for the funeral home at dawn. It swiveled toward me with mechanical precision, a digital eye that watched my breakdown with algorithmic indifference. I sat there for 20 minutes, rain drumming a funeral march on the roof of my rental sedan, before I finally understood. This wasn't a spontaneous decision triggered by grief or stress. This was orchestrated, calculated. While I'd been planning my mother's service and choosing flower arrangements, Derek had been changing locks, installing cameras, and consulting lawyers about the cleanest way to erase me from the life we'd built together. The keys on my ring suddenly felt like artifacts from someone else's existence. The garage remote, useless. The alarm code I had memorized already changed. every tangible connection to the home I decorated, the garden I tended, the future I invested in, all of it severed with the efficiency of a surgeon removing a tumor. My phone rang. A no number with a local area code. Mrs. Jasmine Reed, this is Patricia Hawthorne from Morrison, Lew and Associates. I represent your husband in dissolution proceedings. Are you available to discuss timeline and asset division? Asset division. As if 8 years of marriage could be reduced to a spreadsheet itemized and parsed like inventory in a warehouse. I thought about the inheritance from my grandmother that funded Derek's first 3 property purchases. I thought about the marketing campaigns I designed for his real estate company, working for free because we were building our empire together. I'd worked 16-hour days turning his scattered investments into a multi-million-dollar portfolio, and somehow I was still just the wife with no legal claim to anything we'd built together.
I'll need to get my own representation, I managed to say through a throat that felt lined with broken glass. Of course, we'll send the preliminary paperwork to your current address. Do you have a forwarding location where you'll be staying? Staying. Not living, not residing, staying, like a tourist in my own life. I'm not sure yet, I whispered, which was the first honest thing anyone had said in this conversation. After she hung up, I sat in that rental car until the windows fogged completely, until the December afternoon faded into the kind of gray dusk that makes you forget what season it is. Somewhere behind those locked gates was everything I'd built, everything I'd sacrificed for, everything I'd believed in. My grandmother's antique dining set, my mother's china collection, the photo albums documenting a marriage that had apparently ended while I wasn't looking. But more than the material losses, more than the furniture and jewelry and sentimental objects, Derek had stolen something else. He'd taken my story and rewritten it, casting me as the disposable supporting character in a narrative where I thought I was the co-author. I started the engine and pulled away from Magnolia Lane, watching our house disappear in the rearview mirror like a movie set being struck after filming wrapped. The rose garden I'd planted would bloom again in spring, but I wouldn't be there to see it. Someone else would sleep in the bedroom I'd painted sage green because Derek said it reminded him of my eyes. Someone else would cook dinner in the kitchen where I'd perfected my mother's lasagna recipe. As I drove toward the uncertain territory of my new reality, one thought crystallized with me with startling clarity. Derek had made a crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that taking everything would leave me with nothing. But there's a difference between having nothing and having nothing left to lose. And a woman with nothing left to lose can be surprisingly dangerous. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Hampton Inn on Route 47 smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and broken dreams. I sat on the edge of the polyester bedspread, staring at the divorce papers that had been delivered to the front desk at 7 a.m. sharp, exactly 12 hours after I'd checked in with nothing but my purse, my phone, and the black dress I'd worn to bury my mother. The legal documents were thick, intimidating, filled with language that turned 8 years of marriage into cold calculations. Petitioner seeks dissolution based on irreconcilable differences. Irreconcilable differences. As if love was a math problem that simply couldn't be solved, rather than a promise that had been systematically broken while I wasn't looking. But page 7 that made my hands start shaking. The asset division chart, laid out in neat columns that reduced our entire life together to line items and dollar amounts. Derek was claiming sole ownership of everything: the house, the rental properties, the business accounts, even my BMW that was still trapped behind those wrought iron gates. His justification was elegant in its cruelty. All assets had been purchased under his name for tax efficiency purposes. The inheritance money I'd contributed, listed as spousal gift with no expectation of return, the sweat equity I'd invested managing his properties, voluntary assistance between married parties. I was being erased with footnotes and legal disclaimers. My phone buzzed against the cheap nightstand. A text from Derek's business partner, Cameron Walsh. Sorry about the divorce. Derek said you won't be managing the Oakwood properties anymore. Thanks for everything. Thanks for everything. As if 3 years of turning his struggling apartment complex into a profitable venture was just a hobby I'd dabbled in between episodes of daytime television. I'd implemented the tenant retention program that reduced vacancies by 40%. I'd negotiated the maintenance contracts that saved them thousands monthly. I'd handled the crisis last summer when the main water line burst, coordinating repairs while Derek was golfing in Scottsdale. Another text arrived before I could process the first betrayal. This one from Lindsay, who managed the front desk at Derek's main office. Heard you're taking some time away. Derek's new assistant, Natasha, is really nice. Hope you're doing well. New assistant? Natasha? I opened Derek's Instagram account, the one he'd claimed was just for business networking, and there she was. Blonde, 26 according to her bio, and very definitely not just answering phones. The photos went back months. Derek at a restaurant I didn't recognize, his hand resting on the small of her back. Derek at a charity gala I never even knew he'd attended, her red dress a perfect complement to his black tux. Derek on a weekend trip to the mountains, her smile brilliant against the backdrop of a cabin that looked suspiciously like the one we'd talked about renting for our anniversary. The timestamps told the story my heart didn't want to read. While I'd been researching treatment options for my mother's cancer, Derek had been researching how to replace me. While I was sleeping beside him, planning our future, he'd been planning my exit. I scrolled through months of carefully curated deception, each photo a small knife finding spaces between my ribs I didn't know existed. There was Natasha in Derek's office, the one with the view of the river that I'd helped him decorate. There was Natasha wearing a necklace I recognized, the diamond pendant Derek had given me for our 5th anniversary, the one that had mysteriously gone missing from my jewelry box 3 months ago.
The final image was posted just 6 hours earlier. Natasha's manicured hand holding a set of keys, a familiar gate and circular driveway visible in the background. My rose garden bloomed behind her, indifferent to the fact that the woman admiring it had just moved into my life like she was trying on a dress I'd left behind. The caption made my vision blur with rage. New beginnings in a beautiful place. Sometimes the universe has better plans than we do. #blessed. #new chapter. #home is where the heart is. The universe. As if cosmic forces had aligned to steal my inheritance and lock me out of my own home. As if karma was rewarding her for sleeping with a married man and punishing me for believing in wedding vows. I threw the phone across the room, watched it bounce off the faded wallpaper and clatter onto the industrial carpet. The silence that followed was deafening. No familiar sounds of our house settling, no hum of the expensive appliances I'd researched and selected, no Derek's breathing beside me in the California king bed I'd never sleep in again. Just me, alone in a hotel room that cost more per night than I currently had in my personal checking account, surrounded by legal documents that painted me as a stranger in my own life. But as I sat there, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of a country I'd never visit, something shifted inside me. The crushing weight of betrayal began crystallizing into something harder, sharper. Derek had orchestrated this perfectly. The timing, the legal maneuvering, the systematic erasure of my contributions. He'd played chess while I'd thought we were dancing. But Derek had made one crucial error in his calculations. He'd assumed that losing everything would leave me defeated. He'd counted on my love for him, my conflict avoidance, my tendency to prioritize peace over justice. He'd forgotten that the woman who'd built his empire from nothing was still alive somewhere inside the wife he'd discarded. And that woman was very, very angry. I retrieved my phone from the corner where it had landed, screen cracked but still functional. The first call I made was to Maya Rodriguez, my former colleague at Brennan Marketing Group. The second was to divorce attorney Rebecca Chen, whose billboard I'd seen during the drive from hell yesterday. The third call was to my bank, checking the balance of the one account Derek didn't know about. The small emergency fund I'd built from freelance projects over the years, hidden away like a life raft I'd never thought I'd need to use. It wasn't much, but it was mine. As the December sun set over the parking lot of the Hampton Inn, casting long shadows through the thin curtains, I spread the divorce papers across the small desk and began reading every word, every clause, every loophole Derek thought he'd sealed shut. He wanted a war disguised as paperwork. He calculated that I'd accept whatever scraps his lawyers offered rather than fight for what I'd built. But Derek had forgotten something important about the woman he'd married. I didn't just manage his properties. I'd transformed them. And transformation, I was about to learn, was a skill that worked both ways. The coffee at Brennan Marketing Group always tasted like burnt ambition, but I've loved it anyway. That was back when I had a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Riverdale. When my business cards read Senior Marketing Director in crisp black lettering, when my annual salary had 6 figures and a trajectory that pointed straight up. I'd been 26 when Derek first walked into our offices, wearing a navy suit that fit him perfectly and carrying blueprints for a mixed-use development that would revolutionize suburban living. His smile was confident, practiced, the kind that made you forget to ask the hard questions until after he'd left the room with your signature on a retainer agreement. "I need someone who understands vision," he'd told me during our first meeting, spreading architectural renderings across my conference table like he was dealing cards in a high-stakes game. "Someone who can see potential where others see problems." The Meadowbrook Commons project had been his first major development. 42 luxury condominiums on 12 acres of land that had previously housed a failed shopping center. The previous marketing firm had quit after 6 months, claiming the project was unmarketable due to its location between a busy highway and an industrial district. I'd spent 2 weeks walking the site, studying traffic patterns, researching demographics, and interviewing potential buyers in nearby neighborhoods. Where everyone else saw obstacles, I'd seen opportunity. The highway access meant easy commuting to 3 major business districts. The industrial area was slated for redevelopment into an arts district within 5 years. The failed shopping center had left behind mature trees and established infrastructure that would save thousands in development costs. My marketing campaign had been surgical in its precision. Instead of fighting the location's challenges, I'd made them selling points. Industrial chic meets suburban convenience, where urban energy meets residential tranquility. I'd targeted young professionals who wanted city accessibility without city prices, empty nesters ready to downsize from suburban sprawl, investors looking for undervalued properties in emerging markets. The condos had sold out in 4 months, 18 months ahead of Derek's most optimistic projections. "You're wasted in corporate marketing," he'd told me over dinner at Romano's, the kind of expensive restaurant where they don't put prices on the women's menus. "You should be building empires, not just promoting them."
I'd been flattered, intoxicated by the idea that someone saw potential in me that I'd never recognized myself. When Derek had proposed, both marriage and a business partnership, 6 months later, it had felt like destiny rather than calculation. The wedding had been everything I'd dreamed of. 200 guests at the Riverside Country Club, flowers from the most exclusive florist in the state, a honeymoon in Tuscany, where we talked about the future we'd build together. Derek had presented me with a business plan over champagne and candlelight, outlining how we'd create a real estate empire that would make us millionaires by 40. "Your marketing genius, my development expertise," he'd said, raising his glass. "Unstoppable."
I'd given my notice at Brennan the week we returned from Italy, ignoring Maya Rodriguez's warnings about leaving a secure position for a startup venture. "You're giving up guaranteed success for a maybe," she'd said over lunch at our usual spot near the office. "What if it doesn't work out?" But I'd been in love. With Derek, with the dream, with the intoxicating possibility of building something from nothing. I'd cashed out my 401k, liquidated my stock portfolio, and combined it with the inheritance from my grandmother to provide the seed money for Derek's next 3 projects. The Oakwood Apartments had been our second venture together, a rundown complex with 30 units and a reputation for problem tenants. Derek had bought it for 60% of market value because nobody else wanted to deal with the deferred maintenance and management headaches. I'd transformed it systematically, methodically. New paint, updated appliances, landscaped common areas, and a tenant screening process that attracted working professionals instead of transient renters. But the real innovation had been the community-building initiatives. Monthly resident events, a shared garden space, partnerships with local businesses to offer resident discounts. Within 18 months, I'd reduced vacancy rates from 40% to less than 5%. The property value had doubled. Derek had refinanced and used the equity to purchase 2 more properties. "You're a magician," he'd said, reviewing the quarterly reports that showed consistent profit margins across all our holdings. "I knew you were special, but this is incredible." The third property had been the real challenge. A strip mall in a declining neighborhood where half the storefronts had been empty for years. The previous owner had been trying to sell for 2 years without success. Derek had gotten it for 40 cents on the dollar, then handed me the keys and said, "Work your magic." I'd spent months researching the neighborhood's history, demographics, and economic patterns. The area had been declining since a major employer had relocated, but it was positioned perfectly for gentrification. Close to downtown, with good public transportation and architectural character that developers hadn't discovered yet. My strategy had been to attract businesses that served the existing community while positioning for future growth. A family medical clinic anchored one end of the strip mall, providing stable rental income and serving the neighborhood's aging population. A children's daycare occupied the central space, bringing young families to the area daily. A coffee shop, a dry cleaner, a small grocery store, services that created foot traffic and community engagement. The transformation had taken 3 years, but by the end, we had a waiting list of potential tenants, and property values in the surrounding blocks had increased by 30%. Derek had sold the strip mall for triple what we'd paid, using the profits to purchase a 12-unit apartment building and a small office complex. Each success had built on the previous one, creating a portfolio worth nearly $4 million by our 5th anniversary. I'd managed every property, handled every crisis, developed every marketing strategy, negotiated every major contract. Derek had been the face of the operation, charming investors, schmoozing with city planners, playing golf with bank presidents, while I'd been the engine that actually made everything run. But somewhere in the building of our empire, I'd stopped being a partner and become an employee. Derek's name appeared alone on property deeds because his credit score was higher. Business bank accounts were opened under his Social Security number for tax efficiency. Contracts were signed with his signature because he was the primary business owner. "It's just paperwork," he'd assured me whenever I'd questioned the arrangements. "You know we're equal partners. This just makes things simpler for the accountants." I'd trusted him completely, believing that love meant not needing everything in writing, that marriage was its own form of legal protection. I'd been naive enough to think that building something together meant we owned it together, regardless of whose name appeared on documents I'd been too busy to read carefully. The warning signs had been there, scattered like breadcrumbs through our last 3 years of marriage, but I'd been too focused on growing the business to see the pattern. Derek had gradually taken over client meetings, claiming I was needed more on the operational side. He hired Natasha as his assistant, insisting he needed someone to handle his increasingly complex schedule.
He'd started attending industry events alone, saying I was too valuable to take away from property management. I'd interpreted his words as appreciation for my contributions, not recognition that he was systematically isolating me from the public face of our business. While I'd been working 16-hour days to optimize our properties, Derek had been working to optimize me out of our partnership.
The cruelest irony was that my own competence had been my downfall. I'd been so good at managing the day-to-day operations that Derek had been free to focus on networking, relationship building, and positioning himself as the sole architect of our success. Every problem I'd solved efficiently, every crisis I'd handled without involving him, every smooth operation I'd maintained had become evidence that he didn't need me as much as I'd thought he needed him. By the time I'd realized what was happening, it was too late. The empire I'd built had become the fortress Derek would use to lock me out of my own life. Every contract I'd negotiated in his name, every property title I'd agreed to put solely under his ownership, every financial decision I'd made for tax efficiency, all of it had become ammunition in a war I hadn't known I was fighting. Sitting in that hotel room with divorce papers that reduced 8 years of partnership to a list of assets I supposedly had no claim to, I finally understood the true scope of Derek's strategy. He hadn't just stolen my money or my home, he'd stolen my professional identity, my reputation, my proof that I was capable of building something extraordinary. But Derek had made one crucial miscalculation in his elaborate plan. He'd assumed that erasing me from the paperwork would erase me from the story. What he'd forgotten was that buildings don't manage themselves, tenants don't retain themselves, and business relationships don't maintain themselves. Every contractor who'd worked with me for years knew whose phone calls got problem solved. Every tenant who'd lived in our properties knew which name appeared on the maintenance request responses. Every business partner who dealt with our company knew who actually understood the details of our operations. Derek might have had his name on the deeds, but I had something more valuable. I had the relationships, the knowledge, and the track record that had made those deeds worth owning in the first place. And now I was going to use everything I'd learned building his empire to tear it down. 3 weeks into living at the Hampton Inn, I'd memorized every stain on the carpet, every crack in the bathroom mirror, every sound the ice machine made at 3 a.m. when insomnia held me hostage. The daily rate was eating through my emergency fund like acid, but every apartment I'd looked at required references Derek could sabotage, or credit checks that would reveal the financial chaos he'd created. My lawyer, Rebecca Chen, had delivered the news over coffee at a diner that smelled like grease and disappointment. She'd spread the preliminary discovery documents across the scratched Formica table, her expression carefully neutral in the way attorneys perfect when they're about to destroy your last hope. "He's claiming the inheritance money was a gift," she said, pointing to a highlighted section that made my vision blur. "Since you deposited it into joint accounts and never filed separate documentation establishing it as separate property, legally it becomes marital property subject to division." I stared at the pages until the words lost meaning. $57,000? My grandmother's life savings, carefully preserved through the Depression, 2 wars, and decades of modest living, reduced to a line item that Derek could claim half of, despite never having met the woman who'd saved every penny. "What about the properties I developed?" I asked, my voice sounding hollow, even to myself. "The Oakwood complex, the strip mall project. I have emails, contracts, proof that I managed everything." Rebecca's pause lasted too long. "Management isn't ownership, Jasmine. Without your name on the deeds or partnership agreements establishing equity share, your contributions are considered volunteer work." Volunteer work. 8 years of 16-hour days, canceled vacations, missed holidays with my dying mother, all reduced to the legal equivalent of charity. She's also claiming you abandoned the marital home voluntarily,
she continued, flipping to another section. Since you left after receiving the divorce papers and haven't attempted to return, he's arguing that you forfeited any claim to the residence. The irony was suffocating. I'd been locked out, but because I hadn't created a scene trying to break back in, I'd legally abandoned my own home. My restraint, my desire to handle things civilly, had become evidence of my willingness to leave everything behind. But the worst revelation was still coming. There's also the matter of business debts, Rebecca said, her voice gentler now, as if she could soften the blow through tone. Derek's claiming the company has significant outstanding obligations that would offset any asset division. He's provided documentation showing loans, contractor payments, and operational costs that allegedly leave the business with negative net worth. I knew those numbers were fabricated. Our properties generated consistent profit. Our operating costs were minimal. Our debt-to-income ratio was excellent. But proving it would require access to records Derek controlled, accountants Derek had hired, banks where Derek was the sole signatory. "How is this legal?" I whispered, more to myself than to her. "It's not about legal or illegal at this point," Rebecca replied. "It's about what we can prove. And unfortunately, your trust in your husband created a situation where proof is going to be very difficult to establish." That night, I sat on the polyester bedspread with my laptop open, scrolling through job listings with requirements I no longer met. 5 years experience in corporate marketing, but I'd been managing properties for 8 years. MBA preferred, but I dropped out of graduate school to build Derek's empire. Portfolio of successful campaigns required, but all my successful campaigns had Derek's name on them now.
My phone buzzed with a text from Maya, my former colleague who'd been trying to help me network back into corporate marketing. Talk to Sarah at Morrison Industries about the marketing director position. She said Derek called as a reference and mentioned you'd had some personal challenges that affected your work quality. Sorry, hun, that position is probably not going to happen. Derek wasn't just taking my past, he was poisoning my future. Every reference, every professional contact, every bridge back to the career I'd sacrificed was being systematically burned while I sat helpless in a hotel room that smelled like industrial disinfectant and broken dreams. The walls felt like they were pressing inward, the generic landscape paintings mocking me with their bland optimism. I'd fallen so far so fast that I was getting dizzy from the altitude change. 3 months ago, I'd been driving a BMW, living in a house worth $800,000, managing properties worth millions. Now I was rationing meals and wearing the same 5 outfits on rotation because my credit cards were maxed and my checking account balance had more zeros after the decimal than before it. I called my mother's best friend, Helen, the only person left who'd known me before Derek, before the empire, before I'd become a cautionary tale about trusting the wrong person. "Oh, honey," she said when I explained the situation, her voice thick with sympathy that felt more crushing than comforting. "I wondered about that boy when your mother was sick. Never seemed to visit much, always had somewhere else to be when she needed help." She was right. During Mom's final months, Derek had been notably absent from hospital visits, claiming work emergencies that somehow always coincided with chemotherapy appointments. I'd made excuses for him then, convinced that everyone grieved differently, that his discomfort around illness was understandable. Now I realized he'd been protecting his time with Natasha, guarding his new relationship from the messy reality of cancer and death and family obligations. While I'd been holding my mother's hand through her final weeks, Derek had been holding someone else's. "Your mother worried about you giving up so much for him," Helen continued. "She never said anything directly, but I could tell. She was proud of what you'd accomplished at that marketing company." The weight of that revelation settled on my chest like a concrete blanket. My mother had died knowing I'd sacrificed my independence for a marriage that was already failing, and she'd been too kind to say anything that might hurt me more. I ended the call and sat in the darkness, too numb to cry, too exhausted to be angry. The silence was complete. No familiar house sounds, no Derek's breathing, no future plans to distract me from the present catastrophe. Just me, alone with the ruins of a life I'd thought was solid. My reflection in the black window looked like a stranger. Hollow cheeks, shadows under my eyes, clothes that no longer fit properly because stress had stolen my appetite along with everything else. I looked like what I'd become, a woman who trusted so completely that she'd forgotten to protect herself. The laptop screen dimmed automatically, plunging the room into darkness, broken only by the red digital clock that announced it was 2:47 a.m. Another sleepless night in an endless series of sleepless nights. My mind replaying every decision, every missed warning sign, every moment when I could have chosen differently. Derek had been right about one thing. I was excellent at seeing potential where others saw problems. The tragedy was that I applied that skill to him instead of protecting it for myself. But lying there in the darkness, surrounded by everything I'd lost and nothing I'd kept, something began crystallizing in the space where hope used to live. It wasn't anger anymore. Anger was too hot, too temporary. It was something colder, more focused. Derek had taken everything I'd built, but he made a crucial error in his calculations. He assumed destroying my legal claims would destroy my capabilities. He confused having my name on documents with having my knowledge in his head. But knowledge isn't property that can be stolen or erased with paperwork. Relationships can't be transferred with a deed. Reputation, real reputation, built through competence and integrity, doesn't disappear just because someone changes the locks. I opened the laptop again, its pale light illuminating my face in the darkness. Instead of job listings, I pulled up a blank document and began typing. Not a resume or a cover letter, but something else entirely. A business plan. If Derek wanted to play the game where only legal ownership mattered, I'd show him what happened when someone with actual expertise decided to compete. He had my properties, my money, my home. But I had something he never possessed and could never steal. I knew how to build empires from nothing. And I was about to do it again. The business plan I'd started at 3 a.m. had grown into a 40-page document by the time I checked out of the Hampton Inn 2 weeks later. Not because I was ready to move forward, but because I'd finally found a studio apartment in the warehouse district, 600 square feet of exposed brick and questionable plumbing that I could afford with what remained of my emergency fund. The apartment came furnished with desperation. A Murphy bed that groaned when I pulled it down, a kitchenette with appliances from the Carter administration, and windows that faced a brick wall so closely I could have reached out and touched it. But it had reliable internet, decent cell service, and most importantly, it was mine. No Derek, no Natasha, no memories of the life I'd built and lost.
I'd spent those 2 weeks doing something I should have done years ago: forensic analysis of my own professional history. Armed with my laptop and a determination born of having nothing left to lose, I'd begun systematically documenting every contact, every relationship, every piece of knowledge Derek couldn't steal through legal paperwork. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source, LinkedIn. While scrolling through my professional connections, I'd noticed something Derek hadn't anticipated. Of the 47 contractors, suppliers, and service providers I'd worked with over the years, 31 were connected to me directly, not to Derek's company profile. They knew my name, my phone number, my reputation for solving problems and paying bills on time. More importantly, they knew the real story behind every successful project Derek was claiming credit for. These weren't just business relationships. They were collaborations built on mutual respect and consistent results. Tony Ricardo, the contractor who'd renovated the Oakwood apartments, had my personal cell number saved under Get Stuff Done, Jasmine. Angela Martinez, the landscaping specialist who'd transformed our strip mall's curb appeal, had texted me congratulations when she'd heard about the property sale, not knowing Derek was about to erase me from the narrative. I created a spreadsheet, old habits from my corporate days, cataloging every professional relationship I'd built,
Contractors, suppliers, property inspectors, municipal planning officials, bank loan officers, insurance agents, property management companies, and tenant screening services. The list grew to over 100 names, each representing a professional connection that existed independently of Derek's legal machinations. But contacts alone weren't enough. I needed capital, and my credit rating was about as attractive as a root canal after Derek's strategic financial moves. That's when I remembered something from my corporate days: alternative funding sources that didn't rely on traditional banking relationships. I'd spent 3 days researching peer-to-peer lending platforms, crowdfunding options for real estate development, and private investor networks. The landscape had evolved significantly since I'd left corporate marketing, with new platforms designed specifically for women entrepreneurs and displaced professionals rebuilding their careers. The breakthrough came from an article about something called sweat equity partnerships, arrangements where experienced operators could partner with capital providers, contributing expertise and labor in exchange for ownership stakes. It was exactly what I'd done with Derek, except this time I'd ensure the legal framework protected my contributions from the start. My research led me to a platform called Property Partners, which connected property operators with private investors looking for hands-on investment opportunities. The profile section asked for detailed descriptions of previous projects, references from past collaborators, and evidence of successful property management experience. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of excitement as I began documenting my actual accomplishments. The Oakwood Apartments transformation reduced vacancy from 40% to 5%, increased property value by 120%, established waiting list of qualified tenants. The strip mall revitalization transformed 50% vacancy to full occupancy, increased surrounding property values by 30%, created sustainable neighborhood commercial hub. Each project had documentation Derek couldn't touch: city permit records with my name on the applications, contractor invoices I'd personally approved, before and after photos I'd taken for insurance purposes, tenant testimonials I'd collected for marketing materials. But the real gold mine was something I'd forgotten about: the professional portfolio I'd maintained during my early years with Derek. Buried in my cloud storage were detailed case studies I'd prepared for potential speaking engagements that never materialized, complete with financial projections, methodology explanations, and analyses. Derek might have my legal claim to those properties, but he couldn't retroactively erase the professional documentation I'd created proving my role in their success. Armed with this evidence, I began crafting my property partner's profile with the same strategic precision I'd once applied to marketing campaigns. Instead of hiding my recent divorce, I framed it as a transition from partnership to independent operation. Instead of apologizing for my lack of current assets, I emphasized my track record of creating value with limited resources. The key insight came from my corporate marketing days: positioning. I wasn't a divorced woman starting over. I was an experienced property development specialist launching an independent practice. I wasn't lacking capital. I was seeking strategic partnerships with investors who wanted hands-on expertise rather than passive management. My target market became crystal clear through this reframing process. I'd focus on the segment Derek had always avoided: smaller properties in emerging neighborhoods, buildings that required significant renovation and strategic repositioning. These were deals that demanded hands-on expertise rather than just capital, projects where my operational knowledge would be the primary value driver. I spent a week researching distressed properties in 3 target areas: the Riverside District, where gentrification was beginning but hadn't reached full swing; the Arts Quarter, where young professionals were starting to move in despite limited amenities; and the University Heights area, where student housing demand was growing faster than supply. Each neighborhood represented an opportunity Derek wouldn't touch: too much work, too uncertain, too demanding of actual expertise rather than just financial leverage. But they were perfect for someone who understood how to transform problems into profit through strategic investment and operational excellence. The financial modeling took another week, working late into the night with spreadsheets that made my eyes burn and coffee that tasted like determination. I developed 3 different partnership structures: sweat equity deals, where I'd contribute labor and expertise in exchange for ownership stakes; management contracts with performance bonuses tied to specific improvement metrics; and consulting arrangements that could generate immediate income while building toward larger investment opportunities.
But the most crucial element of my planning wasn't financial.
It was psychological preparation for the war I was about to declare. Derek had counted on my defeat, assumed that losing everything would leave me too broken to compete. He'd calculated that I'd slink away quietly, grateful for whatever scraps his lawyers might eventually offer. Instead, I was preparing to build a direct competitor to everything he'd stolen from me, not just to replace what I'd lost, but to prove that his success had always been dependent on my expertise. Without me managing the details, solving the problems, and maintaining the relationships, Derek's empire would reveal itself to be exactly what it had always been, an impressive facade with no foundation. I created a simple motto that I printed out and taped above my desk. Build better, build faster, build smarter. Every decision would be measured against this standard. Every opportunity would be evaluated through the lens of sustainable competitive advantage. Derek had my old properties, but I knew which ones were already showing maintenance problems he didn't know how to solve. He had my old contacts, but I knew which ones were frustrated with his hands-off management style. He had my old business model, but I understood its weaknesses better than anyone because I'd been working around them for years. The final piece of my strategic foundation was something Derek had never bothered to develop, a personal brand independent of any specific properties or partnerships. I registered a domain name, created professional social media profiles, and began documenting my expertise through industry blog posts and newsletter content. Jasmine Reed Property Solutions had a clean, professional ring that separated my identity from my past failures and future successes. Every article I wrote, every professional connection I made, every successful project I completed would build toward a reputation that belonged to me alone. 3 months after Derek had locked me out of my own life, I submitted my first property partner's proposal for a small apartment building in Riverside District that had been on the market for 8 months without a buyer. The building was exactly the kind of challenge Derek would have avoided: outdated systems, difficult tenants, a neighborhood in transition. It was perfect. As I clicked submit on the proposal, I realized something had fundamentally shifted in how I saw myself. I wasn't Derek's ex-wife trying to rebuild what I'd lost. I wasn't a victim seeking justice for past wrongs. I was a competitor entering a market where I had every advantage except money. And in real estate, money was the one thing that could be borrowed if you knew how to create value with it. Derek was about to learn the difference between owning properties and understanding them. And I was about to show him what happened when someone who'd built his empire decided to build her own. The call came at 7:23 a.m. on a Tuesday, exactly 9 days after I'd submitted my property partner's proposal. I was standing in my tiny kitchenette, attempting to make coffee with a machine that sounded like it was having an existential crisis, when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. Jasmine Reed, this is Michael Thornton from Apex Investment Group. I saw your proposal for the Riverside building on Property Partners. Are you available to discuss a potential partnership? My hand nearly dropped the coffee mug. After weeks of radio silence from every application, inquiry, and networking attempt, someone was actually interested in working with me. I forced my voice to remain steady, professional, despite the fact that I was wearing pajama pants and hadn't brushed my teeth yet. Absolutely. When would be convenient for you? How about this afternoon? 2 o'clock at the Riverside Diner on Mason Street. I'd like to see the property location while we talk. By 1:45 p.m., I was sitting in a corner booth at the diner, wearing my best and only business suit, watching through the window as potential passed by on the street. The Riverside District was exactly what I'd described in my proposal: a neighborhood in transition, with art studios sharing blocks with auto repair shops, young professionals walking past longtime residents, new coffee shops opening next to stores that had been family-owned for decades. Michael Thornton arrived precisely on time. Mid-40s, crisp white shirt, the kind of confident handshake that suggested he'd been making deals since before I'd left corporate marketing. But what struck me most was how he listened when I talked,
really listened, taking notes, asking follow-up questions, treating my analysis like it mattered. "Walk me through your renovation timeline for the building," he said, spreading my printed proposal across the table between our coffee cups. I'd spent 2 weeks preparing for exactly this conversation, visiting the property multiple times, researching comparable sales, calculating renovation costs down to the last outlet cover. Phase 1 focuses on structural and systems updates, plumbing, electrical, HVAC. That's roughly $60,000 in costs, but addresses the major barriers to rental retention. Phase 2 is cosmetic improvements and unit upgrades, another $40,000, but directly tied to rent increases that'll cover the investment within 18 months. And you're confident about the rental market projections? This was where my research paid dividends. I pulled out my phone and showed him the spreadsheet I'd created, tracking rental listings, vacancy rates, and demographic trends for a 6-block radius around the property. Current average rent for comparable units is $950 per month. After renovations, we can justify $1,200, maybe $1,300 if we include parking spaces and laundry facilities.
Michael studied the numbers, occasionally glancing out the window toward the building we were discussing. Your background shows extensive property management experience, but this would be your first independent project. What makes you confident you can deliver these results without the infrastructure you had before? The question I'd been dreading and preparing for simultaneously. Because infrastructure was never what made those projects successful. It was relationships, attention to detail, and understanding that every property has its own personality. Derek's company had infrastructure, but I was the one who made it work. I could see him processing this, weighing the confidence in my voice against the risk of partnering with someone whose marriage had just publicly imploded. I did some background research on your previous projects. The Oakwood transformation was impressive. 40% vacancy to 5% is remarkable. The trick wasn't just filling units. It was attracting tenants who wanted to stay. I implemented community building initiatives, streamlined maintenance response times, and created an environment where people felt like residents instead of just rent payers. That's not something you can replicate with infrastructure alone. We spent another hour discussing financing structures, timeline expectations, and performance metrics. Michael's partnership model was exactly what I'd hoped for. He'd provide the capital for purchase and renovation, I'd contribute sweat equity and operational management, and we'd split ownership 60-40 once the building was stabilized and profitable. But the real validation came as we walked to his car after our meeting. "I've reviewed dozens of proposals for distressed properties," he said, pausing beside the building that could become my comeback story. "Most operators want to flip quickly and move on. You're talking about creating sustainable value through operational excellence. That's exactly what this market needs." The partnership agreement took 2 weeks to finalize, with lawyers reviewing every clause to ensure my contributions were properly documented and protected. I'd learned my lesson about handshake deals and trust-based arrangements. This time, my sweat equity was legally recognized, my management responsibilities were clearly defined, and my ownership stake was guaranteed regardless of any future personal circumstances. Meanwhile, Derek's world was starting to show cracks I'd anticipated but hadn't expected to enjoy quite so much. Tony Ricardo called me on a Thursday morning, his voice a mixture of frustration and loyalty. "Jasmine, I hate to bother you with this, but Derek's got some issues at Oakwood. The main water line I installed 3 years ago is acting up, and he's trying to get me to warranty work that's clearly tenant damage. You always understood these things. Is there any way you could talk to him?" I explained that Derek and I were no longer in business together, but I could hear the wheels turning in Tony's head. Within an hour, he'd called back with a different question. "Would you be interested in consulting on property maintenance issues? I've got 3 other contractors asking me the same question about Derek's properties, and frankly, we trust your judgment more than his."
By the end of the week, I had my first independent consulting contract, helping contractors navigate maintenance issues on properties I'd originally developed but could no longer legally claim. The irony was delicious. Derek's lack of operational knowledge was creating income opportunities for the woman he'd tried to erase from the industry. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Angela Martinez, the landscaping specialist who'd transformed our strip mall's curb appeal, called with news that made me literally laugh out loud. Derek hired some company from downtown to redo the Meadowbrook Commons landscaping, she said, barely containing her own amusement. They tore out all the drought-resistant plants I installed and put in high-maintenance flowers that won't survive the first heat wave. The Homeowners Association is furious, and Derek's blaming the landscaping company. Everyone knows those plants were perfect for the location. Within 2 days, I'd been contacted by 3 different HOA board members asking if I could recommend landscaping solutions for properties in their communities. Not Derek's properties, competing developments where residents had noticed the difference between thoughtful design and expensive mistakes. Each small victory built momentum for larger opportunities. The consulting fees weren't substantial individually, but collectively, they provided something more valuable than money. Proof that my reputation existed independently of Derek's legal claims. Every solved problem, every satisfied contractor, every successful project recommendation was evidence that my expertise had value in the marketplace. The Riverside building purchase closed on a Friday afternoon in March, with Michael and me signing papers in a lawyer's office that smelled like leather and possibility. As I walked out with keys to my first independently owned property in over a year, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed: pride in my own capabilities. But Derek wasn't content to let my small successes accumulate quietly. The first sign of his counterattack came through LinkedIn, where he'd posted an article about the challenges of property management in changing markets. The piece was professionally written, probably ghostwritten, and contained subtle references to former associates who lacked the business acumen to adapt to industry evolution. He was trying to control the narrative, positioning himself as an industry thought leader while casting me as someone who had been left behind by progress. The strategy was clever. He couldn't directly attack my competence without risking legal consequences, but he could imply that my departure from his company had been performance-related rather than divorce-related.
The article got significant engagement from industry professionals, many of whom I'd worked with personally. But instead of feeling threatened by Derek's public relations campaign, I saw an opportunity to demonstrate something more valuable than defensive explanations: superior results. I documented every aspect of the Riverside building renovation with the same attention to detail I'd once applied to Derek's projects, but this time for my own benefit. Before photos, progress updates, contractor testimonials, timeline adherence, budget management, everything was recorded and shared through my own professional channels. The response was immediate and gratifying. Property management professionals began following my updates, asking questions about my methodology, requesting consultations for their own challenging properties. Instead of defending my reputation against Derek's implications, I was building a new one based on current performance and transparent results. But the most significant validation came from an unexpected source: tenant response to the Riverside building improvements. As word spread through the building that new ownership meant actual maintenance response and property improvements, something beautiful happened. Tenants who'd been planning to move started renewing leases. Word-of-mouth referrals brought new applicants who specifically sought out buildings with hands-on management. The waiting list that had seemed optimistic in my business plan became reality within 6 weeks of taking ownership. By the end of my second month as an independent operator, I had consulting contracts with 4 different property management companies, partnership discussions with 3 potential investors, and a building that was ahead of schedule on both occupancy and profitability projections. Derek had calculated that destroying my legal claims would destroy my professional future.
Instead, he'd forced me to discover something I'd never tested while hiding behind his corporate identity. My abilities were strong enough to succeed independently. The woman who'd built his empire wasn't just capable of building her own, she was better at it than he'd ever been. The article appeared in Real Estate Weekly on a Wednesday morning in April, and I almost missed it entirely. I was reviewing contractor bids for the Riverside building's second phase renovations when Maya texted me a screenshot with the message, "Have you seen this? You're famous." The headline read, "Rising Star, How One Property Manager is Redefining Community-Focused Development." Below it was a photo of me standing in front of the Riverside building, looking professional and confident in a way I'd forgotten was possible. The journalist Patricia Vance had contacted me 3 weeks earlier after hearing about my work from Michael Thornton. What had started as a brief phone interview about alternative investment partnerships had evolved into an in-depth profile of my approach to property management and community development. Reading the article felt surreal, like discovering someone had been documenting a life I didn't realize I was living. Reed's methodology focuses on sustainable tenant relationships rather than quick profit maximization, Vance had written. Her Riverside project has achieved 95% occupancy within 3 months, with tenant satisfaction scores significantly above industry standards. But the most validating section came near the end. Industry veterans note that Reed's community building approach represents a shift away from traditional property management to what some are calling relationship-based real estate. Her techniques are being studied and replicated by property management companies across the region. Studied and replicated. My methods weren't just working, they were being recognized as innovations worth copying. The response was immediate and overwhelming. My phone started ringing before I'd finished reading the article. Property investors wanting consultations, contractors seeking partnerships, other property managers asking about my tenant retention strategies. My LinkedIn profile, which had been mostly dormant for months, suddenly showed dozens of connection requests and messages. But the most meaningful response came from someone I hadn't expected. Former tenants from properties I'd managed during my marriage to Derek. Carmen Rodriguez had lived at Oakwood Apartments for 4 years, through the entire transformation I'd orchestrated. Her message was simple but powerful. "I saw the article about you in the paper. I wanted you to know that you changed our lives. Before you fixed up Oakwood, it was just a place to sleep. After, it felt like home. My kids still talk about the community garden you started. Thank you for caring about us." Similar messages followed throughout the day. Tenants who remembered my birthday cards, maintenance requests I'd handled personally, community events I'd organized to bring neighbors together. People whose names Derek had never learned, but whose lives had been genuinely improved by work I'd done that was never officially credited to me. Each message was evidence of something Derek couldn't quantify or claim. Relationships built through competence and genuine care. While he'd been focused on profit margins and property values, I'd been creating something more valuable: community trust and resident loyalty that translated into sustainable business success. The external validation accelerated opportunities I'd been working towards for months. By Friday, I had scheduled meetings with 3 different investment groups interested in partnering on similar projects. A property management company in the Arts Quarter wanted to discuss consulting arrangements. 2 real estate attorneys reached out about serving on an industry panel on innovative property management techniques. But the most significant development came from an unexpected direction. Derek's own business network was starting to fracture. Cameron Walsh, Derek's business partner, called me directly on Friday afternoon. His voice carried a tension I recognized from dealing with problem properties, the sound of someone trying to solve issues they didn't fully understand.
Jasmine, I hope this isn't inappropriate, but I wanted to congratulate you on the Real Estate Weekly article. Very impressive work on that Riverside project. I thanked him, wondering where the conversation was heading. Cameron had been Derek's partner for 5 years, but I'd always handled the operational side of their joint ventures, while he focused on financing and legal structures. I also wanted to ask, and please feel free to say no, whether you might be available for some consulting work. We're having some challenges with the Oakwood property that I think could benefit from your expertise. The irony was almost too perfect. Derek's own partner was asking me to solve problems at the property I'd originally transformed, the one Derek was claiming sole credit for developing. What kind of challenges? I asked, keeping my tone neutral, despite the satisfaction building in my chest. Tenant turnover has increased significantly since the management transition. We're at 30% vacancy again, and the tenants who are leaving cite maintenance responsiveness and community atmosphere as primary concerns. Derek's been handling it personally, but frankly, it's not his strength. Not his strength. The careful corporate language for admitting that Derek couldn't do what I'd made look effortless for years. I quoted Cameron my standard consulting rate, twice what I'd charged other clients, partially because I could, and partially because I wanted to see if Derek's pride would allow him to pay his ex-wife to solve his business problems. That seems reasonable for someone with your track record, Cameron replied. When could you start? The consulting contract took 2 weeks to negotiate, mainly because Derek's lawyers wanted restrictive non-disclosure agreements that would prevent me from discussing anything I learned about their business operations. I countered with performance-based fees tied to measurable improvements in occupancy and tenant satisfaction. The final agreement was a masterpiece of professional irony. I would be paid to fix problems at properties I'd originally developed using methods I had pioneered to restore success Derek was claiming credit for but couldn't maintain without me. Meanwhile, the broader industry recognition was opening doors I hadn't even known existed. The Midwest Property Management Association invited me to speak at their summer conference about community building strategies. A regional real estate investment magazine wanted to feature my Riverside project in their quarterly development showcase. 3 different colleges with hospitality and business programs reached out about guest lecturing on innovative property management techniques. Each opportunity built on the previous one, creating a professional momentum that existed entirely independent of my relationship with Derek or my claims to our former shared properties. I was building something he'd never possessed, a reputation based on current performance and industry recognition rather than legal ownership of assets. But perhaps the most validating response came from the tenants themselves. The Riverside building had become a model for the kind of community-focused development I'd always believed was possible. Tenants organized informal social events, looked out for each other's packages and pets, created an informal neighborhood watch that made the entire block safer. Property values in the surrounding area had increased by 15% since our renovation began, not because of expensive upgrades or luxury amenities, but because people wanted to live in a community where they felt genuinely welcomed and cared for. The local business association invited me to join their development committee. Neighborhood residents stopped me on the street to thank me for improvements that extended far beyond my own property. City planning officials began consulting me about other distressed properties that might benefit from similar approaches. I was becoming exactly what Derek had always claimed to be, a recognized expert whose work improved entire communities rather than just individual properties. The transformation was complete by early May when I received a call that made everything else pale in comparison. Patricia Vance, the journalist who'd written the Real Estate Weekly profile, had been contacted by a producer from a national business television show about featuring my work in a segment about innovative approaches to urban development. They're particularly interested in your background, she explained. The idea that someone could rebuild a career after a major professional setback and create something even more successful than what they'd lost. It's inspirational television, but with solid business fundamentals behind it. As I hung up the phone, I realized something had fundamentally shifted in how the world saw me, and more importantly, in how I saw myself. I wasn't Derek's ex-wife trying to rebuild what I'd lost. I wasn't a victim of divorce seeking validation for past contributions. I was Jasmine Reed, an innovative property development professional whose work was being studied, replicated, and celebrated by an industry that never knew my name while I was building someone else's empire. Derek had spent months trying to erase me from the story of our shared success. Instead, he'd forced me to write a better story entirely, one where I was the undisputed author, director, and star.
The recognition felt better than revenge because it was based on merit rather than vindication. I hadn't just proven Derek wrong about my capabilities, I'd proven something far more valuable. That my abilities had never been dependent on his permission, his resources, or his recognition. I was enough all by myself. And now everyone else knew it too. The summons arrived on a Thursday morning in June, delivered by the same courier service Derek had used to serve me divorce papers 8 months earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me as I signed for the envelope, standing in the doorway of my thriving Riverside building while wearing a business suit that actually fit properly now, that stress wasn't eating me alive from the inside out.
Derek was suing me for breach of non-compete agreements and misappropriation of proprietary business methods. The legal language was dense, threatening, and fundamentally desperate. A last attempt to use the courts to stop success he couldn't compete with legitimately. According to his filing, my consulting work with his former contractors, my speaking engagements about property management techniques, and my partnership with Michael Thornton all violated vague non-compete clauses from our marriage that his lawyers claimed were still enforceable post-divorce. Rebecca Chen reviewed the documents with the kind of cold precision that had made her my favorite type of professional to work with. "This is harassment disguised as litigation," she said, spreading the papers across her conference table. "The non-compete clauses he's citing were never legally binding because they weren't part of employment contracts. They were marriage agreements that dissolved with your divorce." But the real breakthrough came when she reached the final section of Derek's filing. He's also claiming damages from lost business revenue due to your interference with his client relationships. But look at this. He's had to provide financial documentation to support his claims. The numbers told a story Derek hadn't intended to reveal. His property management company had lost 40% of its consulting clients over the past 6 months. Occupancy rates across his portfolio had dropped to levels not seen since before I'd transformed those properties. Maintenance costs had increased by 60%, while tenant satisfaction scores had plummeted. He's essentially providing evidence that your departure destroyed his business model, Rebecca observed. This isn't a lawsuit, it's a confession that he can't operate successfully without your expertise. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for July 15th, giving us 3 weeks to prepare our defense. But Derek had made a crucial miscalculation in his legal strategy. By claiming I'd stolen proprietary methods, he'd opened the door for us to demonstrate exactly what those methods were and who had actually developed them. I spent 2 weeks compiling documentation that would have made my corporate marketing days proud. Every email I'd sent developing tenant retention strategies, every contractor relationship I'd built through personal competence rather than company authority, every innovation I'd implemented that Derek had claimed credit for but never understood well enough to maintain. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Time-stamped emails showing me developing community-building initiatives Derek had never heard of. Contractor testimonials specifying that they'd worked directly with me, not Derek's company. Property improvement records showing that maintenance response times and tenant satisfaction had consistently correlated with my direct involvement, not company policies or procedures. But the most damaging evidence came from Derek's own business partners. Cameron Walsh agreed to testify about the operational challenges Derek's company had experienced since my departure. 3 contractors provided sworn statements that Derek had never demonstrated understanding of the technical aspects of property management, relying entirely on my expertise to solve problems and maintain relationships. Even more devastating was testimony from Angela Martinez, the landscaping specialist whose Meadowbrook Commons disaster had become industry gossip. She provided photographs documenting Derek's expensive landscaping mistakes alongside detailed explanations of why my original plant selections had been strategically superior for that specific location. The hearing itself was held in a courtroom that smelled like old wood and broken promises. Derek sat at the plaintiff's table wearing an expensive suit that couldn't hide the fact that his empire was crumbling around him. Natasha sat behind him in the gallery, looking significantly less confident than in her Instagram photos from my former home. Judge Patricia Morrison reviewed our preliminary documents with the methodical attention of someone who'd seen enough frivolous lawsuits to recognize one immediately.
Derek's attorney, a sharp-dressed man whose confidence seemed inversely proportional to the strength of his case, argued that I was unfairly leveraging inside knowledge of Derek's business operations to compete against him. Rebecca's response was surgical in its precision. Your Honor, the plaintiff is asking this court to prevent my client from using her own expertise she developed independently and applied successfully before, during, and after her marriage. The methods he claims are proprietary are actually industry-standard practices that my client pioneered and has every right to continue using. She presented our evidence systematically. Documentation proving I developed the contested methods, testimonials establishing that my professional relationships existed independently of Derek's company, and financial records showing that my current success was based on superior execution rather than stolen intellectual property. But the moment that decided everything came when Derek's attorney called Derek himself to testify. Under oath, Derek was asked to explain the specific methodologies he claimed I stole. He used my company's resources to develop tenant retention programs, he said, his voice carrying the practiced authority he'd perfected during our marriage. Can you describe these programs in detail? Rebecca asked during cross-examination. Derek's pause lasted too long. Community engagement initiatives, maintenance protocols, that sort of thing. Can you be more specific about the maintenance protocols? Another pause. Standard industry practices for responding to tenant requests. What's the industry standard response time for maintenance requests in multi-unit residential properties? Derek's face flushed slightly. That would depend on the specific situation. Rebecca pulled out a document from our evidence file. According to your own marketing materials, you guarantee 24-hour response times for maintenance requests. Can you explain how you developed this standard? It's based on tenant expectations and competitive analysis. Did you personally conduct this competitive analysis? The silence stretched uncomfortably before Derek finally answered. My team handled the research and implementation. By team? You mean your former wife, who is now my client?
Derek's attorney objected, but the damage was done. Under direct questioning, Derek couldn't explain the basic operational details of his own business model. He couldn't describe the methodology behind tenant retention programs he claimed to have developed. He couldn't even articulate why 24-hour maintenance response times were optimal without referencing analysis I'd conducted. Judge Morrison's decision was delivered with the kind of judicial efficiency that suggests she'd reached her conclusion before closing arguments ended. The plaintiff has failed to demonstrate that the defendant misappropriated any proprietary business methods, she stated. The evidence clearly shows that Ms. Reed developed these techniques independently and has every right to continue using her own expertise in her current professional endeavors. Furthermore, the court finds that this lawsuit appears to be an attempt to use litigation to suppress legitimate business competition. She dismissed Derek's case with prejudice and awarded attorney's fees, meaning Derek would be paying for both his unsuccessful attempt to destroy my career and my legal costs for defending against it. But the real victory wasn't the judicial decision. It was what happened afterward. As we left the courthouse, Rebecca handed me her business card with a note written on the back. Call me about incorporating your consulting business. It's time to make this official. Outside the courthouse steps, Derek stood with his attorney in what appeared to be a heated conversation about next steps and appeals. Natasha waited by their car, scrolling through her phone with the kind of desperate distraction that suggested she'd beginning to realize she'd attached herself to a sinking ship. I didn't feel anger or vindication as I watched them. I felt something more profound and lasting. Complete indifference to Derek's problems because I had my own success to focus on. Cameron Walsh approached me as I reached my car. Jasmine, I wanted to apologize for this whole mess. Derek's decisions don't represent our company's values, and I hope this doesn't affect our consulting relationship. I smiled, realizing that Derek's lawsuit had accomplished something he'd never intended. It had provided public, legal validation that my expertise was not only legitimate, but superior to his. Every contractor, investor, and property management professional in the region now had court documentation proving that Derek's success had been dependent on my abilities. The consulting relationship is fine, Cameron, but I should mention that my rates are increasing next month. Supply and demand, you understand. He nodded, understanding exactly what I meant. Derek had tried to destroy my career through litigation, but instead he'd provided legal proof that I was indispensable to successful property management operations. As I drove away from the courthouse, I realized that Derek had given me something more valuable than any divorce settlement could have provided: absolute certainty that my success belonged to me alone. No one could ever again claim that my achievements were dependent on someone else's resources, connections, or permissions. The woman who'd been locked out of her own home 10 months earlier was now the recognized industry expert whose methods were being studied, replicated, and validated by courts of law. Derek had tried to erase me from our shared story. Instead, he'd forced me to write a better story where I was the undisputed author of my own success. That evening, I sat in my apartment, which no longer felt temporary but had become genuinely home, reviewing contracts for 3 new investment partnerships and preparing for a speaking engagement at the National Property Management Conference. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael Thornton. Saw the news about the lawsuit dismissal. Ready to talk about that second building? I was more than ready. I was just getting started. 18 months after Derek had locked me out of my own life, I stood in the lobby of the Grand Riverside Hotel, adjusting my name tag that read Keynote Speaker, Jasmine Reed, CEO, Reed Property Solutions, and trying to remember what it felt like to doubt my own capabilities. The National Property Management Conference had drawn over 800 professionals to discuss innovation, sustainability, and community-focused development strategies. My presentation, Building Communities, Not Just Properties, was the closing keynote, a position typically reserved for industry veterans with decades of experience in multi-million-dollar portfolios. I had both now, but I'd earned them in the most unconventional way possible, by losing everything and rebuilding it better than before. The morning had started with a text from Michael Thornton. Building number 4 closes next week. Time to start looking at that downtown development opportunity we discussed. 4 buildings in 18 months, each one a testament to the community-focused methodology that had become my signature approach to property development. But the real validation had come from an unexpected source: an congratulatory email from Cameron Walsh informing me that Derek's company was filing for bankruptcy protection. The empire I'd built had completely collapsed without the operational expertise that had made it successful in the first place. Derek's decided to relocate to Arizona and try commercial real estate, Cameron had written. Natasha went with him. I wanted you to know that our consulting contract will be transferring to my new partnership with Stevens Development Group. Your work saved our remaining properties from Derek's mistakes. I felt no satisfaction from Derek's failure, only the quiet peace that comes from seeing natural consequences play out without interference. He'd tried to steal credit for success he couldn't maintain, and the market had corrected his misconception with ruthless efficiency. As I walked toward the main conference hall, I passed a group of young property managers discussing tenant retention strategies. One was explaining the Reed method of community building to her colleagues, describing techniques I'd developed during my darkest period of professional uncertainty. The key is treating tenants like community members instead of just rent payers. She proved that operational excellence creates sustainable competitive advantage better than luxury amenities or aggressive marketing.
They didn't recognize me as I walked by, which somehow made their professional validation even more meaningful. My methods had become industry standard practice, studied in graduate programs and implemented by property management companies across the region. But the most profound transformation wasn't professional. It was personal. The woman who'd once defined herself through marriage and partnership had discovered something more sustainable: self-respect based on individual competence rather than external approval. Standing backstage before my keynote address, I thought about the birthday cake I'd smashed in anger 2 years ago, the symbol of dreams deferred and promises broken. Today was actually my birthday. 33 years old, exactly 3 years since Derek had served me divorce papers while I was burying my mother. The symmetry wasn't lost on me, but it no longer carried the weight of victimhood. Today, my birthday represented something Derek had never been able to provide: genuine celebration of accomplishments that belong to me alone. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our keynote speaker, Jasmine Reed. The applause was warm, professional, respectful, the sound of industry peers recognizing earned expertise rather than inherited status. I walked to the podium with confidence that felt as natural as breathing, no longer needing to prove I belonged in rooms where decisions were made and strategies were developed. My presentation focused on the core insight that had transformed my career. Sustainable success in property management comes from understanding that buildings are just infrastructure for human communities. Every slide, every case study, every recommendation was backed by measurable results from properties where I'd implemented community-focused strategies. But the moment that defined the entire experience came during the Q&A session. A young woman in the front row raised her hand and asked, "Miss Reed, what advice would you give to someone who's lost everything and needs to rebuild their career from scratch?" The question could have been written by my younger self, the woman who'd sat in a Hampton Inn room surrounded by divorce papers and felt like the world had ended. I looked out at the audience of accomplished professionals and realized that many of them probably had faced similar moments of professional devastation. "Losing everything isn't the end of your story," I said, speaking directly to the young woman, but addressing everyone who'd ever felt erased by circumstances beyond their control. "It's the beginning of discovering what you're capable of when you're not trying to maintain someone else's vision of who you should be." I paused, thinking about the journey from that hotel room to this podium, from victim to industry leader, from dependent partner to independent entrepreneur. The most important lesson I learned is that your expertise belongs to you, regardless of who gets legal credit for the results. Knowledge can't be stolen through paperwork. Relationships built on competence and integrity survive any institutional changes. And sometimes losing what you thought you wanted gives you the freedom to build what you actually need. The applause that followed felt different from the polite professional recognition I'd received at the beginning. This was acknowledgement of something deeper, the universal experience of rebuilding from failure and emerging stronger than before. After my presentation, I was approached by dozens of conference attendees. Property managers wanting consulting arrangements, investors interested in partnerships, academics requesting permission to case study my community building methodologies. But the conversation that mattered most came from that young woman who'd asked about rebuilding from nothing. "I'm going through a divorce," she said quietly, away from the crowd of networking professionals. "My ex-husband is trying to claim credit for a business we built together, and I don't know how to prove my contributions were essential." I gave her my card and something more valuable, the blueprint for documenting expertise that exists independently of legal ownership. Start with what you know, not what you own. Your knowledge has value, regardless of whose name is on the paperwork. The market will recognize competence if you give it a chance. That evening, I returned to my downtown apartment. No longer temporary housing, but a chosen home in a building I'd developed myself. The space was furnished with pieces I'd selected, decorated with artwork that reflected my taste, filled with the quiet satisfaction of choices made for my own benefit rather than someone else's approval. My phone buzzed with a text from Maya Rodriguez, my former colleague who'd become one of my closest friends during the rebuilding process. "Saw your keynote mentioned in 3 different industry publications already. Dinner tomorrow to celebrate?" I was looking forward to it, but tonight I had other plans. I pulled out a small cake I'd bought from the bakery downstairs, vanilla frosting, "Happy Birthday Jasmine" written in elegant script by a baker who'd taken time to make the lettering perfect. This time, I'd bought my own candles. As I lit each one, I thought about the journey from Derek's betrayal to this moment of complete professional and personal independence. The woman who'd been locked out of her own home had built something better than what she'd lost.
The wife who'd been erased from her own story had written a new one where she was the undisputed author. I made a wish, not for revenge against Derek or validation from others, but for continued growth, meaningful work, and the wisdom to help others who were facing their own moments of seemingly insurmountable loss. The candles flickered in the evening light streaming through windows that overlooked a city where my name was becoming synonymous with innovative property development and community building. Somewhere in that city, Derek was probably struggling to understand why his Arizona commercial real estate venture wasn't working out as planned.
But his struggles were no longer my concern. I had my own empire to build, my own success to celebrate, my own future to create. I blew out the candles and cut myself a generous slice of cake, not because I was celebrating the end of Derek's story, but because I was finally, fully invested in writing my own. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's building something so successful, so authentic, so undeniably yours that the people who tried to erase you become irrelevant to your happiness. Derek had tried to steal my past. Instead, he'd given me the motivation to create a future that was entirely my own. And that future was just getting started. Have you ever had someone try to take credit for your work or contributions? How did you reclaim your professional identity? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might inspire someone who's currently fighting their own battle for recognition. If this story resonated with you, remember that your expertise can't be stolen through paperwork. Your relationships built on competence will survive any institutional changes. And sometimes losing what you thought you wanted gives you the freedom to build what you actually need. Subscribe for more stories about rebuilding from betrayal and emerging stronger than before. Because your comeback story is waiting to be written, and it starts the moment you decide that your capabilities matter more than other people's recognition of them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.